Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Ahnaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, who joins us each week to give us a brief overview of the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Ahnaf, and good evening from Israel. Two things sort of restarted in the last few days, and a lot of people in Israel are asking if they're connected. And I'll go through them and explain the different positions. First of all, we saw a resumption of war out of nowhere, pretty much caught many people in Israel surprised, certainly those in Gaza by surprise. There was a resumption of military actions within the Gaza Strip. Israel overnight, 2 nights ago, started bombing large swaths of the Gaza Strip, took out a number of Hamas military and government officials, really sending the signal that that's enough. There was a lot of disquiet and discomfort within Israel that Israel was giving Hamas a ceasefire for free, that while no hostages were being released, Israel was still keeping to their side of the deal. And there was really no pressure on Hamas to move back to negotiations, whether it is for a new phase 2, an extension of phase 1, whatever it was felt that there was no real pressure. It's Ramadan, they had enough food, despite the closure of much of the Strip to aid coming in. It seems picture after picture showing iftar meals, the meals that Muslims eat at the end of each day when it gets dark on the month of Ramadan. Showed massive iftar meals being basically funded by Hamas. So they were really under not too much pressure. And it was always a matter of when, not if, that Israel was resume the fighting. It couldn't go on for too long. And it started. Well, the question is exactly why it started and what are the goals of this resumption of war. One, which was stated by some, was again to reach the war aim of eliminating Hamas, not just its military, but also its governing ability. That's one of the war aims from the beginning of the war. The second, which was also stated, which some find contradictory to the first, is the fact that perhaps it was time to put pressure on Hamas to return to the negotiating table. And it was more of a tactic than a strategy. And the idea was that if you start hurting Hamas, then they have more of a reason to go back to the negotiating table. Remains to be seen how effective that is. There is some movement. Some Hamas spokespeople have said that we are looking to return to negotiations. But again, they've given that caveat that they expect negotiations to lead, if not up front, or at least during the process, to an end of the war and a complete withdrawal of all troops from the Gaza Strip. That's obviously a non-starter for Israel, and Hamas know it, but they have to play that game. But there is a certain amount of optimism in Israel that negotiations will restart in the coming days. At the moment, there's no Israeli negotiating team, not in Doha and not in Cairo, where the negotiations have taken place since the beginning of the war. But what we did see today is something, again, that we probably haven't seen in quite a while, if not over a year or more, is widespread demonstrations, not on the streets of Tel Aviv, which we see regularly, but on the streets of Jerusalem. And the difference, arguably, over today's demonstration than the ones that we see regularly in Tel Aviv is that there was a sort of split definition of exactly what they were trying to achieve. If the regular demonstrations in Tel Aviv and around the country, but the largest is always held in central Tel Aviv, was mainly to drive attention to the plight of the hostages, to call for their release, to call on the government to do everything possible to bring everybody home. That was the main message. Yes, there was always an element of anti-government sentiment, if not amongst the majority. There were always certainly pockets of that. Today, what we heard and saw in the streets of Jerusalem, around the Knesset, around Balfour Street, which is the Prime Minister's residence, is really a shift where the majority of the sentiment was that this government is not legitimate, it has no reason to carry on, and the hostages, while still the messages there were prominent, they were certainly not as prominent as they have been. The big question that many Israelis are asking, are the two events connected? Are the return or resumption of the war connected to things that are going on very closely connected to Netanyahu, personal problems, political problems, problems amongst his advisors? What really was the catalyst for today's demonstrations was the intention explicitly made now by Prime Minister Netanyahu to fire the Shin Bet, the internal Israeli security force leader of that, Ronen Bar. As we know, Ronen Bar was one of the leaders of one of the Israeli intelligence services. He accepted responsibility along with all the other intelligence and military leaders since October 7th. So it was only a matter of time before he quit. But now, after weeks of speculation and behind-scenes murmurings and sort of anonymous leakage to the media, we saw officially Netanyahu officially try and oust him. He had a personal meeting with him where they put out an official press release saying that he had asked Ronen Bar to relieve himself of his position. It's supposed to be a vote at some point within the cabinet. Again, to fire Ronen Bar. Let's not forget, even though it's quite easy to, that Israel is a parliamentary democracy. The Prime Minister can make certain decisions, but we don't have a presidential system. And on a lot of things, they have to go to the government. Interestingly, the Attorney General said, actually, there's a step you need to go before, and you need to obtain a recommendation from the Senior Appointments Advisory Committee. The Senior Appointments Advisory Committee is a committee which basically advises and recommends who's going to be appointed to, I think there's 6 positions, 6 very senior civil service positions, including the head of the Mossad and the head of the Shin Bet. The Attorney General, who herself is also on the chopping block, has said that there was a law, I think it was in 2016, which she reads, and her office, the Attorney General's office, has read as needing to have that recommendation before going to the other steps. This is something which has created outrage amongst Netanyahu and his loyalists within the government. And there was just leaked recordings, as there invariably are these days, from a cabinet meeting, basically telling the Attorney General that she shouldn't be above the people. She's not an elected official. It's about time she reclused herself, as well as everything else. The reason why this all came up now, a lot of people are suggesting the whole furore around Ronen Bar is what has now been defined in Israel's Qatar Gate. Qatar Gate, for those who don't know, are the accusations, and they remain just accusations, that there are certain people within Netanyahu's close circle. Some have suggested, like former Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon, that they even affect the Prime Minister himself, although that has yet to be proved. But what there seems to be gathering evidence is that at least 3 senior advisors, people very close to Netanyahu, have received either through an intermediary or otherwise money from Qatar. Let's not forget that Qatar is, if not necessarily an enemy state, one that Israel doesn't have relations with, and a very problematic actor seen by many, that hosts Hamas, that attacks Israel regularly through the media and through some of its proxies, etc. So to receive money from Qatar, especially at this point, obviously could be seen as very problematic. So much so that former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who hasn't attacked Netanyahu too much personally, recently basically said that if this is true, and he believes that this is true, this amounts to treason, and that would be enough for Netanyahu himself to be fired. Don't know exactly how that would be, but that's the message coming across from some of Netanyahu's opponents. We did get quite a lot of information today that Eli Feldstein, who is one of the main figures in Qatargate, who is under house arrest, still remains under house arrest for leaking documents to foreign actors. There has been mounting evidence, according to the media, these are the claims, that he received money for Qatar. In fact, when he was sitting in the Prime Minister's office, not officially, but sitting there physically, he was receiving money from a Qatari lobbyist. That is the secret recordings that were released today, where an Israeli official who's a resident of the Gulf admitted that he was paying Eli Feldstein while he was sitting in the Prime Minister's office. Eli Feldstein did not get security clearance to be able to be appointed as an official spokesperson, so he was paid from the outside. And according to this Israeli figure, he did so because of issues of VAT, and he couldn't be paid otherwise. But obviously, it really stirred up quite a hornet's nest tonight. As I said, there has been 2 arrests on the basis of some of this information by the police tonight involved in this. There is a gag order, which means in Israel that the media cannot report on new information. But there appears to be very strong developments in that area. And there's a lot of muck, let's say, being thrown in the direction of the Prime Minister. We'll see whether it sticks. We'll see what happens with that. But again, going back to my earlier point, there are those in Israel, especially amongst those demonstrators today, that the return to war and some of the other steps that have been taken recently were typical Bibi steps to distract and deflect the country from some of these very problematic and very challenging goings-on related to Qatar that seem to, as I said, reach the closest elements of Netanyahu's office. What it also does shine a light on is the fact that Netanyahu has a series of very close advisors in the Prime Minister's office, but not civil servants, not paid for by the state. Usually advisors have to be employed by the particular ministry or the Prime Minister's office, and they have to go through a series of security clearances. Obviously, the Prime Minister's office is the highest, but when you are an outside advisor and you're paid by external elements, you do not have to go through any sort of security clearance, yet you are there in the room for some of these meetings, or at least, very closely adjacent, which has also caused a lot of discomfort within Israel. On the wider issue, which I've said for the last few weeks, is the one issue that really, really probably keeps Netanyahu up at night, is the passing of the budget. As I've explained many times, if the budget does not pass by the end of this month, we automatically go elections. There doesn't need to be a law to disperse the Knesset. It's automatic. It's constitutional. As of last week, Netanyahu appeared to have a 60-59 majority, which is a little bit too close for comfort. There are many, many laws that need to be voted on to pass the budget. And all it takes is one person not to be there, one person voting incorrectly, which does happen, and the budget could fall. Now he breathes a lot easier. First of all, he brought in Gideon Sa'ar and his party back to the Likud. They were sort of a newly created party out of people who are a little bit discontented with the Likud, led by Gideon Sa'ar, Israel's current foreign minister, Zev Elkin, and Sharon Haskel, and others. Well, now officially they're all back in the Likud, even though there's certainly no love lost between Netanyahu and Sa'ar. But it's clear that that was part of the negotiations to ensure that there would be no problems ahead of the budget vote. Moreover, even more importantly for Netanyahu, former and now current Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has returned to the government, bringing his seats with them, ensuring that there is a solid majority, and the threats from the ultra-Orthodox, specifically Minister Golkanov, are now without teeth. They've even walked back from it. It now seems that he probably won't resign. And certainly Netanyahu knows that he has the numbers to pass the budget, which will probably be next week. On the ground invasion or the restarting of the war, we saw not just the bombing from the air, but we saw today tanks rolling into the central parts of Gaza, taking over at least half, and on its way maybe to the majority of the Netzarim corridor, that road that bisects Gaza, making it far more difficult for Gazans to move from the north to the south, south to the north. That's something which will certainly bother Hamas, because that was one of the main sticking points for them at the beginning of the negotiations, that Israel would retreat from the Netzarim corridor, which it did. So it is now reconquering at least part of it, and it's certainly going to cause a lot of problem for Hamas. At the moment, Defense Minister Israel Katz has said, we are only at level 1 of our response, and we will notch it up. And we are looking again for a total annihilation of Hamas. So the rhetoric is there. We'll see if it does lead back to the negotiating table. That certainly probably would stop the fighting in the immediate future. And as I said, that seems to be one of the aims at this point. There are no negotiations. There doesn't seem to be any move towards negotiations. It probably will take Israel a couple of steps to notch up the fighting. Netanyahu said this week, very interestingly, that gone are the days where we negotiate, where we don't negotiate where we negotiate when we're not under fire. So really fighting words there, really putting a lot of pressure on Hamas, and we'll see if it leads back to the negotiating table, or Israel has to take further steps towards its other goal of eliminating Hamas on a governing and military level. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. I will begin with a question from David Levine, who asks, one of the freed hostages has suggested that Hamas has rebuilt and added to the network of tunnels in Gaza. How will this impact Israel's current strategy in Gaza?
Well, I would say even more than that. We had comments from Eisenkot, who is a member of Benny Gantz's party and seen as a potential leader of the center-left, maybe even taking over Gantz's party, or at least creating his own party. He has said that, to his understanding, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are pretty much almost back to pre-October 7th levels. He assessed that Hamas now have 25,000 fighters, Islamic Jihad more than 5,000 fighters. So that's 30,000 armed terrorists that have regrouped and rearmed during the ceasefire. And it certainly, if these things are true, and coupled with this information about the tunnel system, it's certainly worrying that Israel, if it's true, again, I want to state that Israel has allowed Hamas to rearm, requip, just reposition itself. And that would mean a longer drawn out war if they decide to go again down that road of trying to annihilate Hamas. I can't imagine, excuse me, for probably in the last a few months that Hamas have been able to rebuild massive parts of demolished tunnel system. But the question is, how much did Israel demolish? If it only demolished the entrances or exits of the tunnels, then perhaps it would be much easier to make that particular tunnel operable again. Israel probably didn't demolish whole tunnels, or at least not as many as it would have liked to. It tried different tactics, whether it was sewage or whether it was even explosive materials at one point, but clearly it wasn't able to demolish the vast majority. Whether Hamas have been able to, over the last few months, rehabilitate this massive tunnel system remains to be seen. But it's clear that as soon as Israel started fighting again, the Hamas terrorists, especially the leadership, went back underground as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. Now, the Houthis in the Red Sea, the other Iranian proxy, have renewed their threats on Israeli vessels and have renewed their attacks on American naval ships. With the fighting resuming in Gaza as well, do you foresee Israel basically getting itself back into another maybe not seven, but maybe another multi-front war here?
Well, at the moment, there's no real front on the northern front. Israel is acting pretty much freely in Lebanon and in Syria, in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank. Israel is clearing out a lot of the refugee camps, making sure that the Hamas terrorist infrastructure is destroyed. So really, the only sort of two fronts that are of great concern for the moment, I'm not saying that Hezbollah cannot be a concern in the future, but for the moment is in Gaza and potentially the Houthis, and obviously Iran itself. With the Houthis, they, interestingly enough, over the last few weeks, when it was clear that Israel was stopping the humanitarian aid, etc., they did threaten and did actually return to attacking what they claimed are Israeli ships. And again, these are ships that aren't usually Israeli. Maybe someone on the ownership company on the board is an Israeli. But interesting, we never heard, and we still haven't heard officially, any Houthi leader say that they will respond by shooting the ballistic missiles once again at Israel. What we did see this week is a ballistic missile coming from Yemen, landing in the Sinai Desert. There's a debate about it, but there were certainly some in Israel who would assess that it was being fired at Israel. It just stopped short. And another one that did set off an alarm, I think it was yesterday or the day before, in the south of Israel, but was shot down outside Israeli airspace. So the Houthis certainly have an interest there because their claim, what they're doing, whether it's in the Gulf or elsewhere, is in solidarity with the Palestinians. Certainly Israel is happy to see, and I'm sure is fully coordinated with what the Trump administration is doing against the Houthis. Again, the language that President Trump is using would certainly be music to Israeli leaders' ears. Israel will not take a part in anything at the moment that could perhaps be diplomatically problematic for the moment, and the Americans don't necessarily need Israel. But certainly if the Americans are able to weaken the Houthis, then it would certainly be a big win, not just for Israel, but for Saudi Arabia and many of the other Sunni regimes in the region, and most importantly, be another significant blow to the Iranian regime. Interestingly, and really to show where the Iranian mindset is, that they are trying to distance themselves from the Houthis. President Trump has been very specific that the Houthis are Iran. Iran is the Houthis. We're no longer falling into that proxy debate anymore, where you can have deniability. Trump is very, very open, whether it's on his Truth Social, that he holds Iran responsible. And even it now came out that President Trump has given the Ayatollahs 2 months to get back to negotiations on the nuclear deal, or else. We'll have to see what that or else is. But certainly the Trump administration is ratcheting up the pressure in Yemen militarily and diplomatically on Iran. And again, finally, the Europeans seem to be in lockstep, at least as far as Iran goes. Because again, some European figures have come out and said that, yes, this shouldn't be open-ended, and the Ayatollahs have 2 months to answer favorably to the offer of negotiations and come back to the table.
Now, what might the fallout look like, no pun intended there, if the United States, if the negotiations do end up failing and the United States and perhaps Israel have to do a joint strike on Iranian nuclear facilities?
Well, there are so many ifs and buts there. Who's going to lead it? Are they both going to do it together? In the past, it's been solely Israel that has attacked Iran. When Israel asked the Biden administration whether it could provide refueling planes, it said no. It went a long way to help perhaps pilots that would be shot down, to give the airspace, et cetera, to give the diplomatic cover, but actually being involved in a sort of joint exercise or, a bombing run of Iran just simply wouldn't have happened under the previous administration. So it'd be very interesting to see if there was some joint operation between the Americans and Israelis. It is clear that Iran is in a bad place. Its defenses are severely weakened. And there is this big debate. Can Iran's nuclear program, be toppled? Can it be just pushed back? Could it then, if you push it back 1 or 2 years, could it relatively easily be brought forward again. What would this mean for the regime? Would it be enough for those elements in Iran who really hate the regime, and there are certainly enough of them, to rise up and topple the regime? I'm sure these are all discussions that are taking place. There have been quite a lot of exercises between Israel and some of its allies, whether it's the US or others, in recent days and weeks. But it still is very, very unclear what if a strike would be approved and what exactly that would look like.
Thank you. Now, Rodney Margolis would like to ask, at what point will Netanyahu permit a nonpartisan October 7th commission?
That's the big question. I should say, that's another issue for many of the demonstrators today. And in fact, the majority of the country, according to polls, want a state committee of investigation. As there's been many in the past, there is a constitutional framework for that. It's appointed by the Supreme Court president. Netanyahu is trying to make the point that the Supreme Court president, first of all, has less legitimacy because didn't go through some of the steps. The government representatives were not on the appropriate committees, but he is officially the Supreme Court president. But one that Netanyahu would accuse, and pretty much is, someone from the left of center, where there has been an attempt at a compromise is by President Herzog, who's tried to bring in another very senior justice on the bench, Solberg, who is known for far more right-wing conservative views, a religious person, someone certainly from the right, and together they would choose the makeup of the committee. And that is one that President Herzog thought could be a good bridging idea, that you would have representatives from the right and the left, but it's one immediately shot down by Netanyahu. It's clear that he does not want such an investigation because it would almost certainly be damaging for him. The IDF has looked into its conduct. The Shin Bet has looked into its conduct. I believe the Mossad is going to release their own report and investigation, although they're not as culpable because they work abroad. But certainly they still have things that they could have looked into and are looking into, which leaves the political level. And Netanyahu's sort of talking points that it's going to be politically biased work very well with his base. This is also a person, let's not forget, that called for a committee, a state committee, when it was someone else in power, and he had less of a problem there. So it's clearly a politically charged issue, but one certainly Netanyahu is trying to avoid for as long as possible. And if the budget does pass, which I certainly believe that it will, he will certainly be strengthened politically. It'll be much harder to bring him down. It'll be much harder to bully him in any way from within the cabinet, within the government. Many of the threats to foil the government will be much weaker, because you don't want to be that party which brings down a right-wing religious government. And so once Israel passes the budget, certainly we'll have, it will strengthen Netanyahu and make it even more unlikely that there will be a state commission of inquiry anytime soon.
All right, thank you. Now, in order to fulfill the goal of completely eliminating Hamas, do you think it's necessary for Israel to reoccupy Gaza? And do you think this is a likely outcome in the days to come?
Well, that's one of the options that is on the table for Defense Minister Yasser Katz, who has said that we may need to go back to all the different areas that we were in the past. And let's not forget that there will be a lot more forces than we used previously, because a lot of them had to be in the northern border and elsewhere, which, while Israel still has to maintain a presence on these other borders, certainly not to the extent that they were during the earlier parts of the war. But then we've also got the fact that there are 400,000 call-ups for reserves, and these are people who have fought already for a year, who are tired, who have been away from their families, away from their businesses, their jobs, their life. And there's certainly a lot of weariness within Israeli society. But if they're called up, I do believe that the majority will come. And if we're talking about 400,000 troops, again, not all of them are fighting. There's a lot of backup and a lot of people who need it in all different positions. But that would be overwhelming force that, yes, it would seem that would go back to a lot of the areas that Israel was in the past, trying to really root out as much as possible Hamas's governing and military capabilities.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. We have reached the end of our podcast for this week. As always, I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course, now for our viewers and listeners, please join us on Friday, the 21st of March, for our first ever Middle East Forum Roundtable panel discussion. We plan on holding these once every month on Friday, and they will feature a panel of experts, scholars, MEF staff, and others. This week's topic will be on Iranian power and influence in the Middle East. So please join us for that. We look forward to seeing you there. And we would also like to see you all at the Middle East Forum's annual policy conference the week of May 19th in Washington, D.C. For more information on that, you can please visit our website at www.meforum.org/policyconference 2025, all one word. We thank you all again for joining us and for your participation, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.